For this video, I'm going to be talking about betting on cup competitions, the things you need to know, and how you can go about it. But first, I'm going to tell you the difference between cup competitions and league competitions as defined in football. So in league competitions, you have teams playing in a league format in which everybody faces everybody home and away. You get a lot of games to correct mistakes and all of that. But in cup competitions, you get one chance or you're knocked out. It's basically knockouts. You face a team. You might not face other teams. You might go through a complete round of games or run of games without facing top teams and find yourself in the final. So they are completely different competitions. That said, here are the things that you need to note when navigating cup competitions as a bettor. First, cup competitions are so different from league competitions in that teams set up differently for cup competitions compared to league competitions. In cup competitions, you know that you have just one chance. So even teams that may be otherwise attacking can decide to park the bus or take a more conservative approach in order to avoid getting knocked out. But in league competitions, you don't see things like that. So you have to take note of that. Also, managers might rotate depending on the kind of cup competitions that the person is engaging in. For instance, you have the domestic cup competitions like the Carling Cup, the FA Cup, and even in other leagues too, they have domestic competitions, not just the English league. But in other competitions like the Champions League, you expect to see top players play and start, and you see less of rotations because those are the more elite competitions that require your best players, because more often than not, you're also going to be facing top teams, as a club. So therefore, when you are betting on cup competitions, you need to note which kind of competition you are betting on. If it's a domestic cup competition, you might see Liverpool play a bunch of youngsters in, for instance, the Carabao Cup, or also known as the EFL Cup. But in the Champions League, you are less likely to see that, especially when you get to the knockout stage. Now, with the new Champions League formats, we have the league phase and we have the other phase, which is the knockout phase. So it's a different kind of cup competition, and that also applies to the Europa League as well and the Conference League. Now, note that they are called leagues, but they are also cup competitions. And for the Champions League, you have the league phase where everybody doesn't play everybody, but you get to play 8 matches and there's a standing. So for that one, you have to also note that all the games are very important for these teams, even though it's a league phase. So you need to keep that in mind. But when you get to the knockout phase, then it gets very tricky. It gets very difficult to bet on. But you need to take note of the approaches of teams. You need to take note of players that are available, injuries and all of that, suspensions as well, and the place where the game is being played. If it's a home game for a top team, it's different from an away game. Approaches are different. An example is Arsenal. The way Arsenal approach games at the Emirates is very different from how they approach games when they go away in Europe. And that's very key because, of course, home support matters in Europe. And even though UEFA has taken out the away goal rule, it still hasn't changed the way teams approach games sometimes. But it's also to be noted that away goal rule has reduced the incentive to attack when you go away, because the away goal does not count as double anymore. Anyway, that said, when you're betting on cup games, you need to take note of all these things. You need to take note of players that are available, the kind of team they are playing, the kind of approach they like to take. So you also have to do your research to find out what teams are going with typically when they go away from home and what they do when they are home. And the way that the fans affect the game and the home support affect the game, basically. Here's how to bet on cup competitions. Now, first thing to note is that referees are a bit more reserved in cup competitions because every card matters a lot more. Teams can get eliminated off mistakes, and also bookmakers are a bit dicey with their odds depending on the situation of game. So you have to take note of that and don't just expect the same kind of odds that you see in league games. That said, when you want to bet, you need to be mindful of the team selection. For instance, recently Inter played a game at home against Red Star. Everybody expected Lautaro Martinez to start, as well as Thuram, who are their starting two. But they started with Taremi and Arnautovic. So that matters a lot. You need to be aware of what is going on, do some research, find out what's happening and what the coach's intention is ahead of the game before betting on it, because you might miss out. If you bet on Martinez to have 4 shots, that greatly reduces because he got to play only about 20 minutes in that game. Now, another thing to note is that you have to look at the form of the players, and in that competition, basically, not just necessarily their general form. There are some players that can be in the best of forms in league football, but as soon as they get to cup competitions, they kind of falter. Alternatively, there are players that have the opposite effect, and there are some players that are just great everywhere. And if you know it's a big game, you know that a player like Cristiano Ronaldo is going to step up. For instance, if it's a Champions League semi-final, a Champions League final, you know, based on his antecedents and his record, that he's going to step up. So you also take note of that. Another thing to note is that head-to-head hardly matters in cup competitions, because the dynamics are different, the stakes are different, and a lot can happen within 90 minutes. So don't use head-to-head to bet on cup games. Just think in terms of where both clubs are, the stakes, and everything else. But head-to-head matters very, very little. Another thing to note is that live betting is something that you can tap into. If you're watching the game and you see a certain trend, you can jump on it. Also, of course, if the game is going to extra time, a lot can change between the regular 90 minutes and extra time, when a lot more things can happen. And if you see that maybe one team is getting tired as you're going to extra time and they've already made all their subs or things like that, you can tap into that and bet on the other team scoring or dominating or anything like that. So just take note of that when you are betting on cup competitions. Is very, very important. And finally, consider adding extra time to your ACAs. Is very, very important, because some things may not happen within the 90 minutes, but in extra time you could still get your outcomes. So just always keep that in mind. The odds may be a bit lower because you're including extra time, but ultimately you get your profit. So keep that in mind when you're betting on betting competitions. That's all I have for you today on this episode of the Betting Academy by us, Betting Expert Nigeria. Take note of everything that we've said, but remember that everything we've said is just to guide you and help you in your betting. You still have to go do your research and everything else that you need to do before you bet on games. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and catch me on the next video, or catch us on the next video. Take care. Bye.